So by now you have seen probably enough news about the protests, about the origins of it, and all the discourse that is being made regarding just race in general in America and how the system itself is oppressive on various factors and levels. And along with that, I want to provide a couple of readings for you during the summer to kind of fuel your activism, or just fuel you a little food for thought in terms of why are we here and how do we get here, and perhaps what are the next steps, right? Because even though racism is something that is easy to say no to, there seems to be something more difficult about it because we are living in a very diverse nation. And so when you have so many races come together, there seems to be something that is more divisive there than just saying racism is bad. It's just a question of how's the system designed to fit all of us in, right? So with that in mind, I propose a couple of readings for you to consider and ponder, and perhaps just kind of like, develop yourself a little bit in this maturity of having conversation on the topic at hand. So a couple things I want you to consider as we're going through these readings here. Number one, a lot of my readings deal with the understanding of the point of view of African Americans and their struggles, because even though we have a surface level understanding of like slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, civil rights, and so forth, there seems to be something about the experience that we're missing. Whether it be the day-to-day or just growing up, or what does it mean to be an African American man versus a woman. So in this case, we need to kind of see what it is in a people's entire background to fully understand the strife that they have and the strife that they're trying to change. At the same time, we need to understand the role of police, because it has been a big topic that's been coming up in the entire discussion, right? Because police are both protectors and enforcers, traditionally protectors, but traditionally also the enforcers too, in the sense that they have always been racially biased, and they have at the same time been designed to serve as a tool, not always in the interest of people, the common people, right? Only for perhaps the rich or the privileged and so forth. So in this case, we need to kind of understand where police are right now and how do we perhaps change that. At the same time, we also want to consider how media plays into revolutions, and perhaps this isn't like a full-fledged revolution yet, but one can tell that America is moving towards something that's a little bigger than it anticipated. So in this case, we've got to consider then how does mainstream media kind of play into changing our perceptions and fueling our dialogue, or even taking away the dialogue in this case here. And at the same time, we need to understand how power resists change, because, we see a lot of protesters on the street, but why isn't it changing as fast as we expect it to be, or hope it to be, or want it to be? So in this case, we have to consider how much power exists already and how much of that power is trying to resist change. And I'll tell you real quick, power does not like change, because power tried very hard to get there in the first place, right? And it's not going to subject itself to vulnerabilities or for it to lose any of that anytime soon. So before we even begin, there's a video that I want to kind of start with, if you have the time to watch it. If not, I'll summarize it. But it's an interesting perspective by Trevor Noah in terms of the African American experience versus police. And, we like to believe that police are not vile people, and that might be true. Like on the individual level, they might not be. But at the same time, they fuel this entire system of race being an issue in America because of what they've done in the past and what they keep perpetuating to do. And his story was very much like this, where white people may not be at fault because they truly do not understand what African Americans go through. Because if you think about the communities that white folks have made with police officers, it really is a bonding in some ways, right? You say hi to them, they say hi to you back. But for African Americans, it has never really been that way, where it's always been suspicion or pinning the blame on, or even excessive force when it does not ask for it whatsoever. So in this case, it's a story where the white folks, or even just mainstream America, is at a disbelief of what police have done and so forth, because they never had that experience to begin with. And so this is something that we've seen more and more on social media, and also even in mainstream news, that the police are not so much the community servers as they are the enforcers of whoever sent them there in the first place. And we need to kind of understand that most Americans have a pretty positive view on police on a traditional level, you know what I mean? And that may need to change before we make any systemic change regarding that there. And before we begin this discussion here, I throw a quote from Dave Chappelle on the talk of race, where he says, things like racism are institutionalized. You might not know any bigots. You feel like, well, I don't hate black people, so I'm not racist. But you benefit from racism just by the merit, the color of your skin, the opportunities that you have. You're privileged in ways that you might not even realize because you haven't been deprived of certain things. We need to talk about these things in order for them to change. And, I make an analogy real quick in why it's so hard to talk about race. And it's something that we all have to ask ourselves on a very reflective level, where there's a difference of this protest in the sense that if you are a person who can walk away from this protest, whether it succeeds or not, and still live a normal life, then you are in that category of privilege, right? And so we have to consider then, what does it mean for African Americans to lose this fight, for example, and to get nothing out of all of this here? Because if you think about the protests going on, for a lot of people who are not African Americans, we don't really have anything at stake here necessarily. And that itself is the troubles of the system here, that it's designed for the sort of disadvantage of one group versus another. And it might not be African American always, right? It might be another group next time, and so forth and so on. We have to talk about this because racism is something a little bit more creative than we kind of expected in this case here. It's not just raw hate, but the system itself is designed to serve different groups in their interest here. And the thing is, the discussion needs to go on a very much back and forth reflection. We have to admit a lot of things. We can't just kind of like full-fledged kind of send ourselves in one direction, because I bring up Chappelle again because he jokes about it, but he makes a lot of good points through his analogies and stories and so forth. In one of his stand-ups, he even says, I'm not saying that I don't like police. I'm not saying that. I'm saying I'm just scared of them. Nothing wrong with that. Sometimes we want to call them too. And let's be honest, after all of this, I see a lot of anti-police rhetoric in terms of like, fuck the police and so forth. And, with good reason, for sure. But if we have to be completely honest, we will want to call them in the future if things go wrong, and we need some sort of protective services or some sort of, insurance in the community, right? But the question again is, how do we fix it to serve everyone? And that's the thing here, where we cannot just simply abolish entire system, because there's no necessarily solution after that here. We want to make sure that everything works for everybody if we're looking for an equitable system altogether. And then even lastly, as a last idea before we even get to the readings here, Chappelle further adds on, Blue Lives Matter. What? Was you born a police? That is not a blue life, that is a blue suit. If you don't like it, take that suit off, find a new job, because I'll tell you right now, if I could quit being black today, I'd be out the game. And so we have to consider sort of what's at stake for everybody here. Is it a job versus a race? Is it, the long-term livelihood versus a part-time career, right? For African Americans, Black Lives Matters really is a story of, can I make a difference in how I am treated on a daily basis on something I cannot escape, right? So we have to consider what is really the weight of everything in terms of being African American, in terms of how the system's designed for them, in terms of how we can kind of perceive it and change it and all that there. And you might be wondering, like, why have I brought in so many like comedians or talk show hosts before authors of anything else? And I want to kind of throw this idea at you here, where humor is tragedy plus time. If you look at any humorist on these topics here, they understand that there is tragedy behind all of this here, but we, in understanding that tragedy, perhaps have to make some humor on it, so we can kind of pick at the issue a little bit more objectively rather than the subjective here. It's not easy to, because it is a sensitive topic, and so it walks a thin line in terms of like jokes versus like satire, for example. But we have to kind of pick through that humor in terms of, well, where did that tragedy come from, and so forth and so on, right? So a couple things that I would consider here is just what we see today is the tragedy, but in the future, as time goes on, we can make humor of it to better contextualize and understand it. Hopefully that's the intention here, right? That we, through ways of perception or telling the narrative and so forth, that we can better understand it all as a package. Now, we have to also understand that racism is a universal tragedy because, the title itself is misleading for a lot of people in the sense that, well, it's Black Lives Matter. Well, why not all lives, right? And the thing is, it should be all lives matter in the sense that should be universal given. The problem is it isn't, right? We definitely see that there's disparities between different groups of people. And so with this particular movement, the sort of tragedy being exposed is how the Black lives have never really been a priority in American history or even in America in the contemporary sense, right? But in the future, we're going to have to address that with all different groups. So you have to support a movement like this in the sense that it sets the precedent for other groups later on. Because in the future, we're going to talk about Asian Americans, for example. We're going to talk about once more the Hispanic community that's been disenfranchised for a long time, or of Middle Eastern folks, or of Filipinos, Southeast Asia as a whole, and so forth and so on. There's a lot of groups in America that are disenfranchised, but if you say no to one group, you basically say no to all groups. We are all in this together, right? So support has to be uniform and universal in order to address that tragedy. So perhaps we can have that humor later on. So with that being said, a couple readings I want to offer for you in this video and in the PowerPoint altogether. The first 4 are from the Black experience altogether, and it really shows in these readings what does it mean to have a Black voice, a voice that's living in perhaps a white America and the struggles of that. So the first 2 are by Roxane Gay. The first one is The Price of Black Ambition. The second one, a speech she gives. And Roxane Gay is always going to speak about the difficulty of not just maybe African American, but also African American woman, and the struggles that these people have to go through. Because, in the fight against white America, African Americans also have to kind of show that they are better than the standards of white America, right? They can't just be just average. They have to be exceptional. And that's always a struggle for African Americans, because if you're anything less than, you are not going to make it into the mainstream narrative of what does it mean to be African American. At the same time, I also offer How to Slowly Kill Yourself and Others in America, a remembrance where it talks about the violence that exists in the African American community from all parts, not even just from police, but also from the existence from the inside, and also to oneself, and what does it mean to be African American being surrounded by all this violence constantly. Now lastly, I offer to you Notes of a Native Son by James Baldwin. He speaks on the existence of being African American as a man and just kind of surviving all of the sort of negative experiences that were parts of the civil rights, and even a little bit before that, right? And the true face of an angry and racist white America, and just growing up with that context there. So with that in mind, the first 4 are to understand Black experience, and I think it's important to do that because we don't spend enough time talking about the narratives of people, which is sad to me, because even though rhetoric and argumentation and so forth is important, you don't really understand a group of people until you hear their story, and that is something to consider for all groups of people and for all future protests that may happen in the future when other groups find the time and the courage and the opportunity to speak on their existence. But we have to understand the ghettos, the historical implications of where African Americans came from, and the struggle of, birth to childhood, to young adult, to old age, and so forth and so on. At the same time, we also have to consider the commentary that authors have made towards police. And in these 3 readings, I offer you, number 1, Hanging by George Orwell, in kind of considering what does it mean to adopt the title of police, and how one becomes desensitized as you enter that field, right? I also offer you, I was the mayor of Minneapolis, and I know our cops have a problem. And Right Back basically kind of exposes from a person of power's position their observations of what has gone on and what perpetuates as a system of perhaps corruption to change and to desensitize those who are dutied to enforce the law. And then lastly, I want to look at when LA erupted in anger. I'll look back at the Rodney King riots, because with Sastry and Bates' long essay here, they examine just what race relations look like from police intervention to how races intermingled and caused issues with each other, and very much how a protest goes wrong, but not even a protest, right? It's a riot for the most part. So in this case, we want to consider why this particular movement is so different, but how does it share similarities with the past, and some of the things we could learn from what went wrong in that past, and why there's so much cynicism in protests altogether. And so police is always going to be a very touchy subject, because we like to believe that police are our protectors, and in some facets they are, because we consider police to be these individuals within our community who go and patrol and serve our interests and so forth. But at the same time, as we look at America in this modern sense, there is an over-militarization of the police. There is a lot of excessive violence coming from one side, and I understand it too from a human standpoint, that if you were putting on that police uniform, you would feel the fear of an immense crowd coming at you. But at the same time, you have to understand what that crowd is fighting for, right? Because if you are going against a crowd that is largely peaceful and with a cause greater than yours, then you have to consider, then why are you holding so dearly onto the uniform than to perhaps drop it for the community that stands in front of you here? And so police really is a difficult issue, because it has to exist, I think, in some form of protection for people, but it can't exist in the way it has been. There definitely needs to be oversight and change. We also want to consider the background of bad roles. I offer you a medieval example, the executioner. And the executioner is an interesting role to me, because the executioner is somebody who did not volunteer for the role. In fact, nobody wanted to be an executioner back in medieval times. Executioners were actually hired people by the state, basically. Butchers, usually common folks, because they had skills with butcher knives and large cleavers. And so these people, they knew that they were not doing anything that they wanted, but they had to, whether morals existed before and after the job. So in this case, we want to consider too, the police is very much like an executioner, right? There are good police in the sense of the individuals, but given the status, given the role, can there really be a good executioner in this case, right? But that's the question for yourself to ponder here. What kind of police are you looking for, and what does it mean to separate individual versus rank and role and persona in this case here? Do they really want to hold on to this position, or are they simply buying into something that's imposed onto them? Now, lastly, I want to talk about the media and power, and a couple of these readings are a little bit denser, so you might have a little trouble with some of these here. But otherwise, I offer you first from Chomsky, Independence of Journalism and a Propaganda Model. And so the question here is this: why are people so divided today, and where does that division come from? And the first one is just how journalism has fed into the problems here, from both sides of left and right narratives, right? How America is slowly kind of like ostracizing one group, or it demonizes another group, and so journalism itself has to be independent of corporations, of the desires of those in power to actually give good news and real news, and news that is progressive in that case there. Propaganda model talks about, again, propaganda, but how is it designed that we are in the system today? I offer you Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punishment. It's an excerpt from his larger work, but in Discipline and Punishment, we're looking at a system that has people basically live within it without even needing laws in the first place, that we are all basically prisoners, waiting for our own punishment, if that makes sense. And so one of the things that you might want to consider from the perspective of those who are anti Black Lives Matter or any sort of protest is that they see themselves as part of a prison, and they are a prisoner who, if you were in Two-Way with me, if you remember the Town, that little cartoon we watched, that guy who was stuck in the jail cell, and even though he could escape, he stitched on his fellow prisoner instead. It really shows this sort of jail mentality, that we would rather follow these bad laws set and govern ourselves with these bad laws than perhaps pursue freedom. So in this case, a lot of people are bought into the programming of whatever state or the US in general, and sort of our perception of what is right, when really it might be wrong. And then lastly, it's a full-on novel. It's called The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration, The Age of Color Blindness. And if you can't read all of it, I at least implore you to read chapter 6. The links are all hyperlink, so you can just jump to that section there. But it's called All of Us or None. And the thing is, division helps those in power, because if you think about these protests, there's nothing really stopping them right now, because they're unified under one message. And that's what people in power fear, when everyone is gathering together under one common cause, right? Because there's momentum under that, there's organization under that. And so it really is all of us or none, because we have to understand that from every group, every age, every background in general, we have to come and support this movement here. Power is interesting, because power is also how you present information to people. So if you think about those who you perceived as ill-read, or those who don't understand it from your point of view, it's because of how news has been delivered and how information has been delivered. Because on the one hand, it looks like a peaceful protest to some, but to others, depending on how the news spins it, it is just the riots and the looting and so forth, right? So we have to be careful in terms of what the news provides. Even on your social media platforms, you want to be careful of what you are being given in information. Like, you don't want to subject yourself to only one source of news. News today is really commentary, if anything. So if you go on to like an MSNBC or Fox News or CNN, whatever, it's not just raw news, right? Someone's speaking to you. Someone with a particular agenda or thought process or a voice or whatever is trying to persuade you. So in this case, you want to be careful with the information you're given in its entirety here. And so, just as an example, if you look at this headline from Fox News, it says, Orlando man tried stabbing police with syringe during George Floyd protest, police allege. And so I'm thinking, if I was a Fox News reader, wow, it is a violent protest. But if you look at the very first line of the entire article, even though protests on Tuesday in Orlando were mostly peaceful, some arrests were made. And so we ignore that first part then, that it was mostly peaceful. They have to, keep that in, because that's the fact of it. But the way they organize and structure information is deceiving to us all. And it could change our perception from the get-go, because, let's face it, a lot of people read the headlines and not really the actual content of it itself. So with all that said, a little bit of food for thought for you as you go on to your lives. Just not, to be passive and all that, and to kind of answer the question of what can I do as a basic individual. Because, you might be thinking like, oh, we need a leader, or we need somebody who's in charge, or whatever, right? That's not necessarily true. If you think about the protests right now, they are all a largely spontaneous, sure, but groups of random common folk who together have a singular goal. And through the discourse, they come to that, right? That's why protests are important. They're coming together to speak on those issues there. So as you are going through life and so forth, I offer you kind of 4 things to keep always in your mind. Number 1 is that anyone can propose bills, legislative choices in California. And so if not the entire US, at least here, so we can set the tone for everyone else, right? So in this case, if you are perhaps developed enough, you're, really investing your time into developing a proposal for change, then you can always, with yourself or with a group, propose changes in our ways of executing the law, or what the law is in the first place. At the same time, keep an eye out for what bills are, trying to be passed, because there are definitely bills that are tricky, in that they try to get ulterior motives from the finer line underneath what's proposed. Again, headline versus content, right? So in this case, just as you're going through life, always be aware of what is being said about a bill and what the components of it are. Thirdly, I want you to consider that you never want to forget about your immediate community, because even though it was nice to see all these different groups come together, it is a miracle almost that all these groups came together. It can't happen without a strong community. So in this case, you want to make sure that you're always sort of looking back to where you are, where you came from, and how you can kind of help those around you thrive as well. And then lastly, as you all are right now, just continue to listen. Don't be afraid to participate. Like, it is scary to protest and so forth, but, if anything, have faith in the ordinary person. History is largely determined by the common man. And so in this case, don't think that with no leader, we can't do anything. Something's being done already, you know what I mean? Like, it's young people who are largely driving this here. So just keep that in mind, that participation comes in many different forms, but never do no participation in all this here. So with closing thoughts, I offer you a quick video at the end of all this here to consider, voices of people who have been activists and sort of their perspective on all this that's happened. But really, it is a sort of group versus individuals, right? There are people in power who don't want to let go. And these people have tried their entire lives to basically control the masses and to make sure that one group gets more versus another. It's what's called tribalism. It's collectivism. It's really, my group versus your group, that sort of mentality. But as this generation is showing, we should not follow that particular mentality because it is destructive to humanity altogether. And if you feel like there is no power in all of this, I get your fear, but don't be afraid, because if I have to end on an analogy here, in chess, it seems like the king is, so far away and defended with so many different ranks of people around them to protect them. But don't, forget that the pawn can always check the king. And that's what the people are doing right now, that collectively all the pawns are grouping up so that the king realizes he or she cannot escape anymore and they have to concede. We are close to a checkmate, And the fight has to go on for that checkmate to finally finish in a game.